1889, how to set up and play. So this is the island of Shikoku in the late 19th century, and we're going to play rail barons, trying to build the rail networks up throughout this small island, and try to win the game by investing in corporations that will pay us dividends, and hopefully also see the value of our stock portfolio go up. So by the end of the game, the player with the highest net worth in combined stock value and cash on hand will be the winner. The game will rotate between stock rounds, where players will be buying and selling stock certificates in the various public corporations, and then operating rounds, where the owner or the majority owner of the public corporation will be operating its train on the main island. Building track, laying station tokens, running railroads, and deciding whether to pay dividends or retain earnings, and buying other trains. So let's walk through setup and some of the different visual cues on the board. So the very first thing we do is set the bank size. It's different for every 18xx game. In 1889, the bank size is set to 7,000 yen. So take all that in the form of paper cash or chips and get that exact amount. That is one of the ways that the game can end, is when the bank busts, you'll complete that series of operating rounds, and at the end of that, you'll tally up all the value of stock and cash, and the winner will be determined. The other way the game can end is if an individual player goes bankrupt. And that usually happens if they're required to support their public corporation in the purchase of mandatory new trains, and they're unable to do so. They could possibly go bankrupt. Based on the number of players, you will also provide the initial capital for each player. Every game, every 18xx is a little different. Some games have a general pool of money, and that's split evenly between the players. In 1889, it's based on the number of players, and you can see there's a certificate limit also in terms of the number of stock certificates combined with private company certificates that a player can own. And then certain privates are removed in a 2 or a 3-player game. So if this was a 2-player game, all players would be limited to 25 certificates, and then each player would receive $420, and that comes actually out of the $7,000 starting capital of the bank. So now's probably the best time to talk about a very important concept in the game, and that's distinguishing between player funds and corporation funds. So these are the funds that a player will receive at the beginning of the game, and that's how you win the game. At the end of the game, you have your own personal wealth is greater than all other players, and that will be kept separate from corporation funds. So when a corporation is formed, and we'll talk about this, it will get capitalized based on the value of the stock, and that money will be kept in the company's treasury. And this treasury money will be used to buy new trains, to pay terrain costs when laying tracks, if applicable, the cost for laying station tokens, and other things. So it's important never to mix corporation money with private money. There's ways that money can be exchanged between the corporation and the player, and we'll cover those. So let's go through setup of the various components. Here you'll see all the public corporation charters in the game. There's 7 public corporations in the game that can be started. For each public corporation, each one will have a different number of station tokens. It indicates the name of the railroad, the coded-in railroad. It'll also indicate where its starting location is on the map, and you can see the coordinates of the location. It will also give you a summary of the different eras in the game. This is the same on each charter, and we'll cover that later, along with some standard rules that apply to every company. There it also shows where its starting station token will go. So every public corporation starts on a specific location on the game board, and they each have a different number of station tokens available to them. This is the initial offering of stock certificates that correspond to each of the 7 public corporations. There's 9 certificates because the one on top is called the President's Certificate, and it's actually worth 2 shares. You can see 2 tokens there. Each share of a corporation is worth 10%, and since the President's Certificate represents 2 shares, it's worth 20%. We'll cover this later, but this is a little bit different than other 18xx games like 1830, where it takes 60% of the company's shares to have been sold in order for it to activate and operate. In 1889, only 50% of the shares need to be sold for it to activate. So the president's share and 3 other individual certificates, and the company will operate. Here are all the different trains laid out for the game. You lay out all the trains regardless of the player count. And normally during the game you might want to fan these out so players can see how many of each train are left in the game. And the purchase of trains will serve as a way to kind of time the different eras that this game has taken place over. So a couple things to point out. This indicates the number of locations that this train can service. So that could be towns or cities or off-board locations on the map. So a level 2 train can service 2 different locations, and it costs 80 yen to purchase. And it also shows here that it becomes obsolete when the first 4 train is purchased. So it's rusted or obsolete when the 4 train comes into the game. The first one is purchased. You'll also notice that the color of the number indicates kind of the era of the game. So while 2 trains are in the game, we're playing in kind of this first era where only yellow tiles can be placed on the board. Here you'll see the color changes. So when the first 3 train is purchased, yellow and green tiles can be placed on the board. It costs 180 yen to purchase, and these become obsolete when the first 6 is purchased. The 4 trains cost 300 yen to purchase. Again, it'll keep us in the yellow and green era, and it becomes obsolete when the first diesel train is purchased. Level 5 trains cost 450 yen, and they're considered a permanent train. They're never made obsolete through other trains. 6 is also a permanent train. It costs 630 yen to purchase. And then the diesel trains cost 1100 to purchase. This indicates that a discount, you can purchase this for a discount of 800 yen by trading in a 4, 5, or a 6 train. And a diesel train means it can service an unlimited number of locations on the map, cities, towns, or off-board locations, servicing each one only once. It's important to mention that trains must be purchased by public corporations sequentially. So a corporation could not purchase a 3 train until all the 2 trains were sold out and purchased. And so now is probably a good time to talk about the different eras of the game and how the purchasing of trains influence that. So this chart is on every charter, and it shows you to start the game, only 2 type trains are available. The color indicates that we can only upgrade or place tiles of the yellow variety on the board, and every public corporation is limited to only having a maximum of 4 trains. It shows the train price for the 2 trains, and it shows the number of trains that are in the stack. And it shows that when the 2 train is purchased, it doesn't obsolete any other train. And then there is 1 operating round in between stock rounds during this first era of the game. So let's keep going on. When the first 3 train is purchased, that immediately puts us into the next era. So now yellow and green tiles can be placed on the board. And when we talk about tile upgrades, we know that yellow tiles can be placed on normal hexes, green tiles can be used to upgrade yellow tiles, and brown tiles can be used to upgrade green tiles. You cannot place brown tiles straight away on the game. They have to be placed on top of a green tile, which was upgraded from a yellow tile. But when the first 3 train is purchased, the train limit stays the same. 180 yen for the 3 trains. There's 5 of those. And then the most significant thing when the 3 phase happens is that there's 2 operating rounds in between each stock round. That's right here on the board. So during the first phase, we would have 1 operating round, and then we'd have another stock round. An operating round, stock round. But once the first 3 gets purchased, it comes here, and we actually have that operating round, and then a stock round. And you can see it cycle through. Another important thing that happens when the first 3 train gets purchased is that private companies can now be sold or purchased by public corporations. And we'll cover that later when we get to private companies. When the first 4 train is built, the train limit goes down. So all public corporations can now only have 3 trains in their inventory. So if they did have 4 trains, and once the first 4 train is bought, they'll have to discard one of their trains to get down to 3. A discarded train, assuming it's not obsolete, would be put into the open market, which could be acquired by another player if forced to. So when the first 4 train is purchased, a 3 train limit, that's the cost, there's 4 of them in the deck, and most importantly, all 2 trains become obsolete. The 4 trains rust the 2 trains. So immediately when when a corporation purchases the first 4 train, all 2 trains currently in the game are discarded out of the game immediately. So if a corporation was planning to operate and use those 2 trains later in the operating round, they'd be unable. When the first 5 train is purchased, the train limit goes down to 2 trains per corporation, and it will cause the operating rounds to go up. There'll now be 3 operating rounds before each stock round. And then when the 6 is purchased, the train limit stays the same, but it rusts all of the 3 trains in the game. Also, when the first 6 train is purchased, that makes the diesel trains available for purchase. Normally, all the trains would have had to have been purchased in a prior level before a corporation could buy the next one. The only exception is once the first 6 train is purchased, a corporation can now buy the diesel train. Another thing to point out is, it's not listed here, but when the first 5 train is purchased, all private companies close, so they get discarded out of the game. So hopefully by then you would have used the special power, or if able, you would have sold it to a public corporation to earn money. But the 3 and the 5 are the biggest eras that affect the private companies. Once the first 3 train is bought, some private companies can be sold to a public corporation on a agreed upon price, which ranges from half the printed value up to 2 times the printed value. But once the first 5 train is purchased, all private companies close and discarded out of the game, and any powers or restrictions that they had are now obsolete. Also keep in mind that the operating round change doesn't take into effect until after the next stock round. So if we were in this green phase with 4 trains, and so we were operating with 2 operating rounds in between a stock round, and the first 5 train is purchased, we would not go to 3 operating rounds until after the end of the next stock round, and then we would start the phase there. Next, let's take a look at the stock market. It's a two-dimensional stock market, and a couple key things to keep in mind, and we'll cover this during the stock round. But each corporation, in addition to their 2 station tokens, come with 3 additional markers that you get used to get marked 3 different things. So when the president's certificate is bought and they decide on the par value, you will mark that there, and we'll cover this in depth. When the company floats or has 50% of its shares bought, it becomes active on the stock exchange, and so you will mark it here since that was its starting price, and it has to go inside of this red box. If, for example, another company gets started on the same turn for the same par price, it's important to put that underneath here, because this will indicate the order of operation. And the higher value public corporations operate first in the operating rounds, and if 2 companies are in the same exact space, it's the one that started first. We'll talk about this more in the operating round. But if 2 corporations occupy the same value, 80 and 80, it's the one that's furthest to the right that would operate first in the operating round. So the first of the 3 tokens is to mark the initial par price. The second is to use to mark and keep track of the current share price of its stock value. And the last one is used in this game to mark the earnings per share. And you'd update this after each operating round based on how profitable its rail networks were on the board. So if it was collecting $30 worth of revenue based on its network, it would be paying 10% of that, or $3 per share of dividends. And you can keep track of this on this track. While we're here, we'll cover a couple more things. During the operating rounds, trains or public corporations will have the chance to pay dividends to shareholders. Whenever it pays a dividend, and we'll talk about this later, it can move 1 space to the right. If it was here, this shows that instead of moving 1 to the right, it would move up. There's also situations if shares get sold in the stock market, let's say 3 shares of this corporation get sold, so it's going to drop 3 spots, 1, 2, it can't go below this floor here. So it can protect companies as they move further to the right from decreasing too radically in stock value. Same thing over here. During the operating round, a corporation may decide to retain earnings, and whenever it does that, it moves 1 space to the left. Here, it would have to go down if it retained earnings. If a corporation was at the top of the stock chart, obviously it has no movement there. And if it's at the highest value, it could go no further to the right because there's no arrows here. As long as a public corporation's stock value is in a white space, there's no special rules applied to it, but you can see there's yellow and orange sections. If a corporation's stock value was ever in the yellow section, a special rule gets applied to it. Basically, the certificates from that corporation do not count against a player's limit. You'll remember that based on the player count, players are limited to holding a certain number of certificates. So in this case, the coded-in railroad, any certificates held by the players would not count against that limit. Now, if on a subsequent move, this company became, paid dividends and moved out, then the player during the next stock round would have to sell a number of shares to conform to the limit again. They're not automatically lost. They just, at the next soonest opportunity, they've got to get back down to the limit. If a company stock value is in the orange, the rules of the yellow apply. Its certificates don't count against the limit. Also, there's no ownership restriction. We haven't talked about this yet, but an individual player is only allowed to own a maximum of 60% of the company, so 6 shares. Here, if a company is in here, that lifts that restriction. So me as the player, I could own 80% or all 10 shares of the company. no, same rules apply. If it ever moved out of this zone, the next opportunity that I had in a stock round, I would have to sell shares to conform to my 60% ownership limit. You'll notice that there's no brown zone. Some 18xx games, like 1830, have an additional brown zone where the rules from the yellow and the orange apply, and in addition, there's no restriction on how many of those shares I can buy in a stock round. When we get to the stock round, I'll mention that on your turn of a stock round, you can only buy one certificate until your turn comes around again. But if a company is operating in a brown zone, which isn't in 1889, you could buy as many as you wanted of that you could afford. But that doesn't apply to 1889, but I wanted to call that out. Also, as part of setup, you'll lay out all the available track tiles. You'll remember we mentioned that yellow tiles can be placed on these bluish spots on the board. That's the initial upgrade that can take place. Yellow tiles can then be upgraded to green tiles, which can be upgraded to brown tiles, but only when we advance in the different eras of the game, as we've talked about. It's important to keep in mind that these tiles are limited, so I fan those out so players can see when they're getting depleted. In some cases, there's only 2 of a specific tile or 1 of a specific tile. So once that tile is gone, it's unavailable. Now keep in mind, if a green tile is used to upgrade a yellow tile, that yellow tile will come off the board and be returned to this supply for reuse. Let's talk about the anatomy of a tile. This icon, that little hash black, you'll see it isn't there. It's meant to indicate that that tile was built over a small town in the game. So if I was to build coming off of here, because I'm placing there, I have to pick a tile that represents that town. Also, it shows the number, the value or the revenue gained by a train servicing this town location. Here you can see the revenue goes up for a train servicing this city location. So the white circles represent different cities on the board. And so when a track tile is built to one of these cities, or on a tile with a city, that needs to represent that the city was part of there. You'll also notice as yellow city tiles get upgraded to green tiles, more station spots open up, and then these can be upgraded to brown tiles. One other thing to point out is you'll notice is that the yellow stations, or the yellow tiles that indicate towns, there are no green upgrades with town hashes. So these couldn't further be upgraded because there's no green with hashes. It's important to keep in mind, and we'll talk about this later, is that when you upgrade the tiles, you always have to maintain the existing links. You can't destroy track. You're only enhancing the value of the track. But we'll cover that later in depth. One other quick thing about laying tile is you can never build tile that runs off into the ocean. You can also not build tile that connects into a permanent gray tile without the track there. As you're laying out all the tiles for the game, you're going to notice that some tiles are specifically associated with cities in the game. So keep these separate. This brown tile could not be used to upgrade any green tile on the board. It's only used to update the city of Kuchi. So you can kind of associate those and put those off to the side. Typically the city will have a special indicator, like here you can see there's an additional yen value to upgrade this tile to that special brown tile, where most cities will not have that. Also in this game, Kota Hira has special tiles that are used to upgrade it. So you can see it starts as a normal area, but to upgrade this would cost an additional 80 yen to upgrade this first city tile, and you'd have to start with the yellow, and then as the eras progressed, it would upgrade to this specific green, and then to this specific brown. You see there's no additional charge. Well, there is. There's 80 yen to upgrade this green one, but then from the green to the brown there's no additional, but it gives you a lot more station placements. So we'll put those off to the side, remembering that Kota Hira has special tiles. And then finally, Takamatsu has special tiles. Here there's no dollar upgrade to upgrade from the yellow to the green, but you can see this special icon here. This is referencing that there's a private company, A, which is the Takamatsu E-Railroad, that is actually running its operation on this tile. And we'll talk about these later, but this is basically blocking track upgrades on this tile. You can still operate to this city location, but you cannot upgrade that tile unless you have the associated power with that A private, but we'll talk about that. But Takamatsu has specific upgrade tiles for its city, green and brown. So we'll set those aside. So let's look at some of the other iconography on the map. As we've talked about, a white circle indicates that this is a city location, the city of Saiju or Nihama. This city has actually a public corporation token in it. Matsuyama is the city, and it's associated with the Iwo Railroad. So when the Iwo Railroad is initiated, its token goes in the city of Matsuyama. And that's what that's indicating. You'll notice that some tiles already have a tile upgrade. So the city of Ozu already has a yellow on it. So you cannot put a different yellow tile on up here. Throughout the game, it would have to be upgraded with the green. Some with the gray, this is their permanent track or tile upgrade. Grays cannot be upgraded any further. In some 18XX games, they can be. In 1830, 1889, they cannot be. This is the most advanced track this city of Yawatahama will have. Here's one with the gray, and it's indicating that this railroad, the Awa Railroad, or the UR, will start there, and it has 2 station tokens. These, as we've talked about, are towns throughout the game. The town of Nakamura, or Nangoku, or Muki. Again, those are associated with these on the yellow track tiles. Some of the terrain has an additional terrain cost when building on it. So when we get to the operating round, most of the time laying track is a free action unless there's a special charge to upgrade the city, or if you're building track through dangerous terrain like a mountain range. The public corporation would have to pay an additional 80 yen to build on that spot. Here's a spot that costs an additional 80 yen because you're building track over a river. And now it's probably important to talk about these. These are off-board locations that rail networks can connect to. And then when the train is operating on those, they would receive revenue for that location based on the phase of the game. So if we're still in the first phase of the game, this location would pay 20 revenue for a network connecting to that, 40 once we get to the brown trains, and then in the diesel phase this would pay 80 revenue. Here's another permanently upgraded track location, the town of Moroto, that has a town marker on it. It'll pay 20 revenue when building through it. Here are some additional off-board locations that can be connected to earn revenue. These are just extensions of the earnings per share track that you can add to. In the town of Ozu, there's a private corporation C the Ehime Railroad that is affecting track building or tile laying on that town. So we'll get to that in the privates. And then finally on the board you can see there's a horizontal and a vertical grid that can help you reference tile locations, especially when you're trying to locate something or if you were trying to locate the starting location for a corporation. The final thing you'll do as part of setup is lay out each of the private companies in ascending order. So the A has a printed value of 20. You'll see 30, 40. It's important that you list those out in order. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 private companies in the game of 1889. This tile is associated with that private company, and the game will start with an auction of the private companies. So let's get ready to play.